Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Steinberg Halion 7 tutorial series. Today we're going to take a look at the heart of the modulation engine in Halion. It's called the Modulation Matrix. It looks really intimidating and dense, but actually when we get to grips with it, you'll see that it's pretty intuitive and a really flexible and powerful way to handle all of our modulation options in Halion. If you're enjoying this series so far, check out my Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to help support my channel. Now for today's episode, I've loaded up our good old faithful hexagon preset. It's an excellent way to demonstrate how the mod matrix works. I've selected the top node in the hexagon program and I've opened the modulation matrix section in the zone editor. You can see that I've locked it as well. Now, this is a slightly clunky aspect of the interface. I should be able to click on the animal layer and in an ideal world all of this would turn white. It doesn't. You kind of have to come away from the layer and back to it in order for Halion to figure itself out, so that's not great. But let's not dwell on our shortcomings. What we're actually going to do is select the Skylab layer, and this is where we're going to start today. This is the simplest of the 3 modulation routings in the hexagon preset. If I solo the Skylab layer, I'm going to turn my modulation wheel all the way down. You can see it at the bottom of the interface here. And as you can see, the modulation wheel is mapped to the level. So we have a source mapped to a destination by this much. This is the modulation depth. So when I press a note, we're going to settle out to volume. Let's get the level meter up. This short term is the current level. When I turn the modulation wheel up, sound gets louder. You can also see that we've got this little ongoing display, this active display that tells you the current level of the modulation output, which is really handy. So that's as simple as a mapping can get. One source mapped to one destination. We have a modulation amount which specifies how much this thing is going to affect this thing. We have 32 of these slots available. If I scroll down, you can see others. All of this stuff is primarily note expression. Beyond the remit of today, I don't want to worry about it. Up at the top of the matrix is the stuff that we're most interested in. I'm going to change this modulation destination from level to pitch, the easiest of all of the modulation destinations to demonstrate because it's so obvious what's going on. I'm going to turn my mod wheel all the way down, press a note. So there's the stable C, and there's the pitch going up, and back down again. Nice and straightforward. What happens when we make this modulation routing bipolar? Let's click the little bipolar button. So I'm playing a C with the modulation wheel all the way down. I'm getting a note 2 semitones lower than the C that I'm actually playing on the keyboard. At halfway on the modulation wheel, there's my C. Modulation wheel all the way up to maximum, 2 semitones above. So I'm now playing D. So the level, this current level, you can see it's mapped to just over 2 semitones. That's the limit in either positive or negative directions because we've gone bipolar. Switch back to unipolar mode. The amount is still the same. We're still operating at 2 semitones from a C up to a D, but now we're only traveling in one direction. So bipolar actually effectively doubles your modulation range because you get this much in both positive and negative directions. I'm just going to make this modulation depth up to 7 semitones. That's a perfect fifth. So now there's my C up to a very slightly sharp G. If I click on the edit source button, we can change the shape. So the easiest way to demonstrate this is to introduce a pulse curve. So now it's going to stay flat on C for half of the journey of the modulation wheel. I'm turning the mod wheel up right now, as you can see, and then suddenly, there we go. When the modulation wheel reaches this point, we immediately jump from no modulation, playing a C, all the way up to maximum modulation, jumping up 7 semitones in a single step. So you can introduce really quite complex curves. So I'm turning the modulation wheel up and down here pretty smoothly in kind of a sort of sine wave fashion. And it's actually drawing this complex multi-wave modulation graph. So this is modulation wheel all the way down. This is modulation wheel all the way at the limit. We have a definable curve and all sorts of other options available, pretty straightforward. You can also set the minimum and maximum. So if I drag this little blue arrow, the maximum value is going to come down. So now, even when the modulation wheel is all the way up at maximum, we're only going to get halfway towards the level that we would otherwise have fully attained. The reason why you have so many different constraints on Halion is because multiple different sources and destinations can be mapped together in increasingly complex ways. You might think, well, why would you deliberately constrain yourself to only have half of your entire range available to you? Because multiple different things might be modulating this single destination, and you want to do them basically with a single level value but to different extents. But I'll leave it simple and linear for now. Now I'm going to introduce a second modulation source. So at the moment the modulation wheel is applying its modulation to the pitch, but I can also state that it's going to be dependent on a second source as well. So I'm going to introduce aftertouch. In logical terms, this is an AND gate. Both of these conditions must be true in order for the destination to be affected. The simplest way to demonstrate it is to leave the modulation wheel all the way at maximum, press a key, there's your C. There's no modulation at all on this note, turning the modulation wheel up and down. It's only when I press into the aftertouch, here we go, that the pitch change occurs. So both of these sources must be at non-zero in order for me to have any impact on the pitch. Now this is a really practically useful thing to do, because aftertouch can be a bit of a pain when you kind of accidentally go into it when you don't want to. You might just hit the key very slightly too hard. Whereas if you turn your modulation wheel all the way down, now it doesn't matter what I do with the aftertouch, I'm pressing into the aftertouch now. The second of those two logical requirements, the modulation wheel, that's at zero. So there's no modulation to the destination. It's like a safety gate. Now the hexagon preset itself has a dual source input in the studio strings, but it's not a particularly good example because the modulation wheel has been mapped to both sources 1 and 2. The second entry is redundant. If the modulation wheel is turned up, it's turned up. This isn't going to basically do double duty. It's not going to change the pitch by twice as much. Easy enough to demonstrate that. Let's solo the studio strings. Switch to pitch to make the example really obvious. So there's my modulation wheel going all the way up. We've settled out at G. Take one of these two modulation sources away. Matters not a jot. One of them is good enough to do that job. So that's just an artifact of the preset design where the second modulation source has been left in effectively inadvertently. It's not doing anything. I've selected the anima layer now and soloed it so that we can have a look at these three modulation options. I'm going to turn two of them off just for the moment, and we'll have a look at the modulation wheel first. Again, we have a second unnecessary source too. I'm just going to turn that off. So the modulation wheel is mapped to filter cutoff. Turn the modulation wheel all the way down and up. Sound gets duller. Don't forget, this is an inverted modulation routing. So it's a low pass filter that's being applied. We have the cutoff frequency being negatively modulated. So as we turn the modulation wheel up, the filter cutoff comes down. The next easiest to look at is slot number 1. Let's have a look at this one. So MM stands for modulation module. These are the individual, basically like plugins that you can add onto Halion. So Halion doesn't really fundamentally understand what these things are because they're effectively external modules that are being loaded in. One of the consequences of that is that we don't have the jump to. This isn't a section inside the primary editor that we can jump to, but it is a component of the sound. If I select that LFO so that that's now the focused module and jump over to my sound tab, this is always a context sensitive look of what's going on. You can see the LFO cycling here. You can also access these MIDI modules from the MIDI mod section and you'll get basically the same view. So we've got this very slowly cycling LFO operating over an 8-bar cycle. What's it doing? It's changing the wavetable position in the anima macro, and we haven't really dealt with wavetables too much yet. We'll dip very briefly into it without going into too much detail. This is a wavetable, and you can basically scan through this table, and all of the different positions in it are going to give you different waves. If you look at it from the two-dimensional perspective, it's just a wave, but as we cycle through, you can see the wave changes. And every time I press a key, depending on whatever settings are inside the anima macro, you're going to get a different kind of sound. So the low frequency oscillator is basically scanning through this table over the course of 8 bars. We take the modulation away and then bring it back in. Can you hear it? It's quite a subtle change, but it is definitely changing the nature of the sound. Let's try and capture it a little bit more nakedly by changing the speed of the LFO. And then it's really obvious what's going on now. I've made quite a few changes to the sound there. I'm just going to reload Hexagon so that I'm back to my simple preset. Solo anima again. And now we can have a look at the third slot. So this time we have dual sources actually doing a functional job. We've got 2 different modulation sources here. Firstly, the filter envelope. Let's click the jump to source arrow to jump over to the filter section, and I can lock the section open so that we can have these 2 side by side. This is the filter envelope. This is the thing that's doing the work on the modulation. You can see it starts out by turning the modulation up to maximum and then very quickly drops down every time a note is played of the sequence. See that filter envelope operating. Let's hear it more clearly. So that's the sound all on its own. And there's the filter envelope sculpting those upper frequencies away. We've also got this second modifier, another modulation module, this time LFOB. Let's have a look at LFOB. So this is a sine wave operating over the course of 4 bars. 16/4 is a 4-bar period. And we're getting duller, and then we're going to brighten up. There we go. So once again, this is an AND gate. Both of these modulations being applied simultaneously to have a cumulative effect on the sound. Dual source modulation matrices are really powerful because you can combine the effects of these 2 sources together for a single output effect, but you do need to bear in mind there's an equivalent increase in complexity for you to try to understand what's going on here. So now we've got a better chance of understanding why this anima layer is such a rich and complex sound, because we've got all of these different modulation mappings, combination of the wheel, 2 independent low frequency oscillators, plus this filter envelope, dedicated filter envelope, all of these input sources having an effect on the sound. It's also an excellent illustration of multiple different sources, in this case spread across 2 different slots, both mapping into the filter cutoff. These 2 things are fighting with each other. The filter envelope and the LFOB are having a positive modulation impact on the cutoff, but the modulation wheel is fighting against that. When you turn the modulation wheel up, it's pulling the cutoff down, and it's the cumulative effect of all of these values together. All of those values are going to get added together into what's effectively a single control voltage, a single instruction going into the filter to say, do this to the cutoff. They might be fighting against each other, but basically when you add all of those numbers together, it's going to result in a single number. It's just a very complex relationship between all of these different sources. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.